Okay, natural resources. Today, let's start looking at some of the common trees that are grown in North Carolina. I'm trying to make this as streamlined as possible because I know that with the number of trees that we have on this list, it can get kind of long. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to fast forward to the picture of the tree, and then you can actually copy the description of the tree down in your course packs from the PowerPoint that's listed in the module. So the first thing we're going to look at is the American elm, or you can pause here and write it down as I go to the picture of the elm. So the first tree we're going to look at is the American elm. This is a fairly large tree with an average height of 75 to 100 feet and a diameter of 2 to 5 feet. For me, the biggest descriptor on the American elm is going to be both the leaves and the bark. And I used to tell people when I used to do a lot more forestry type stuff, and there is a forestry competition for FFA, that the way that I remember the elm tree as compared to some of the other ones is by the bark. I think about the scary movie Nightmare on Elm Street and Freddy Krueger and his long fingernails, and so I think about the idea that this elm tree bark has been scratched with those long Freddy Krueger fingernails. So that's how I remember what the elm tree looks like as compared to some of the other trees that we'll take a look at. But pretty distinctive bark, pretty distinctive leaves, and a pretty common tree in our area. The American holly, this one I think is one of the easiest ones to be able to identify. And the reason that it's easy to identify is because it has pretty distinctive leaves. When you were a kid, you probably had, well, if you had friends like I did, which doesn't sound like very good friends at all, they'd take these leaves off of shrubs and trees and poke you with them. These leaves have got little spines on them, and so that's one thing that makes them pretty recognizable as compared to some of the other trees on the list, is the spines that are on those holly leaves. Sometimes in the cold weather part of the year, you'll also see some of these berries on the holly trees as well, and typically they have a fairly smooth bark on them. The next is the American sycamore. There's a lot of description there. Here's a picture of the entire sycamore. The next pictures are actually going to have the leaves and the fruit on them. So the next slide will actually be a little bit more descriptive than this one. The sycamore tree is probably one of my favorites. It's a very large tree, has large leaves on it, and has a pretty unique bark. So these leaves are pretty large with the lobes on them. They typically are going to have 3 to 4 lobes, which is basically like these little finger things that are sticking out there on them. And they're going to be fairly large. This is usually easily recognized by the bark. They typically have got what they call a mottled bark, which is a bunch of different colors mixed together. And there are lots of these in North Carolina. You probably have seen these along riverbanks in areas where there's ponds or streams or things like that. As they do get older, you do start noticing more furrows in the bark, which means they're ridged. But most of your young bark is going to be that kind of mottled gray color. There are also fruits on the sycamore tree, and those fruits on the sycamore tree tend to be kind of this fuzzy looking spiny type ball. Not exactly like the sweet gum, but also is a ball type of fruit. And you can hear my house phone ringing in the background. Next, we're going to take a look at the bald cypress. And the bald cypress typically grows in the edge of water. And so these are going to be near ponds and lakes, normally even swampy areas, normally not necessarily rivers or streams running water, but usually still water. And you can see how they kind of, near the bottom of them, they're very slim near the top, and as they get near the water, you can see how wide they get around the base of them. These actually grow well literally in the ponds and in the bottomlands. We have several of these at the FFA Center. So if you've ever been to FFA camp, this is the type of trees that they actually have in the water at FFA camp. The interesting thing about bald cypress is they have these things. You can see one sticking up right here. If you can see where I'm circling. That's called a cypress knee. And sometimes what happens is the older the tree gets, sometimes the roots of them tend to start coming up out of the water, and those roots that are coming up out of the water are called knees, just like your knee on your leg. So a lot of times they'll have these cypress knees sticking up out of the water, so that makes them a little bit more identifiable. The bark tends to be reddish brown, and they do have a cypress type fruit on them. Speaking of fruit, the black walnut has a fruit that is pretty sought after in our state, or in general. The black walnut is a large tree. The thing about a black walnut and being able to recognize it as compared to some of the other ones is that you basically have these pinnately compound leaves. So when I'm talking about that, you've got these alternate leaves that are right across from each other on the leaflet branch here. This is not a walnut tree leaf. This whole thing is a walnut tree leaf. So walnut trees have got what we call compound leaves. And whenever you have a compound leaf, you basically go all the way back to where the bud is on the tree, and that tells you where the leaf starts. So if you were to go all the way back to where the bud starts on a walnut tree, it's going to start somewhere down here near where the tree is, instead of all these little leaflets. So this is one of the trees on the list that has a compound leaf, and the compound leaf is going to have multiple leaflets to it versus having a single leaf. These are pretty popular too because of the walnut fruit. You can see there's some young walnut fruit right there that has not had time to reach harvesting stage. As it does reach harvesting stage, it's going to dry out and have kind of a brown coating on the outside, and then the bark itself on a black walnut is going to be pretty deeply furrowed, meaning it's going to have pretty deep ridges down in there. Okay, moving on. Right now it's time for the persimmons to start producing fruit, or they're actually producing fruit right now. They normally are going to have fruit in the September-ish time of the year, close to September, October. So right about now, if you like persimmons, you might find some that are producing fruit. The interesting thing about a persimmon tree, and one that helps you to be able to identify it, is right here. The bark of a persimmon tree typically is kind of a checkerboard pattern, and there aren't a whole lot of trees that have that checkerboard pattern. Dogwood has a checkerboard pattern, but it's not quite as deeply furrowed as what you're going to see on a persimmon tree. A persimmon tree tends to be pretty tall, and it's this time of year you're going to see these fruits on it. They are edible, and there are old wives' tales that say that if you open up a persimmon fruit and look at the seed inside of a persimmon fruit, if it's shaped like a fork, then you're going to have a mild winter, or if it's shaped like a spoon, then you're going to have a tough winter with a lot of snow that you're going to have to be shoveling out. I don't know if there's any truth to any of that stuff, but I do know that right now people are collecting persimmons this time of year, so you might be able to find somebody that has some and actually try some of that fruit. But biggest ID factor is going to be that checkerboard bark. The eastern red cedar is next, and this one, let me look back over my list here. Hang on a second. This one is going to be the one that's probably going to have the smallest leaves of anything that we've seen so far. These are needle type leaves. they're basically what we call scale type leaves because they kind of are going to and I wish I could zoom in a little bit, but I can't. They basically are going to have scales on these needles that kind of lay on top of one another. The eastern red cedar, it is an evergreen type of tree, and so it's going to be green year round, and they're going to have these little cedar fruits on them. But these are pretty common, and they're a lot of times are used for um, hiding, uh, like used along the edges of yards as kind of like a border, hiding fences, hiding places in the yard you don't want neighbors to see, or creating a privacy screening or something like that. So these eastern red cedars have a tendency to grow pretty tall, and the reason they're called red cedar is because when you do chop them down, the wood inside of them has a tendency to be kind of a red color. So that's the eastern red cedar. All right, we're going to go to another evergreen tree here. This is an eastern white pine. And I have a couple of slides on the eastern white pine, so I'm going to go ahead and go to the pictures so that we can talk about it. The needles on these are kind of going to be a bluish green. The needles on an eastern white pine are short and fine as compared to something like a loblolly. A loblolly tree is going to have a much more long, coarse type of needle, but the needles on these are not nearly as long as what you're going to see on some of the other types of pines. So these are going to be 3 to 5 inches long. They're going to be in bundles of 5, and they're going to have these pretty long, narrow-looking pine cones on them. They do grow naturally throughout the mountains, and they're going to do better if they are on cool, moist, and sandy soils. So we don't have as many white pines in Cleveland County is what you're going to see in some of the eastern parts of the state. But these do get to be pretty tall, and this is the largest conifer, meaning that it is a cone-bearing tree in eastern North America. So these are fairly common in North Carolina, not quite as common as the next pine tree that we're going to look at, but there are a lot of white pines in our state. The next one is the loblolly pine, and of course this is the state tree of North Carolina, and this is the most important commercial timber tree in North Carolina because these are grown throughout the state. Loblolly pines, they're pretty much grown everywhere from coast to mountains. These are going to be in clusters of 3, and the needles themselves are going to be 6 to 9 inches long. So these are going to be a much longer, more coarse needle than what you're going to see on an eastern white pine. Their cones are not nearly as long as what you saw in the eastern white pine. They're more of an oval shape as compared to that long oblong shape is what you saw in the eastern white pine, and typically you're going to just be a little more oval and rounded. The bark itself, and I don't think I have a good close-up of the bark, is going to be kind of a bright reddish brown, and you're going to have kind of flat plates over the top of it. Yeah, I don't have any pictures of the bark on this, but you can check that out at some point. These grow throughout the eastern part of the state really well, throughout the eastern Piedmont part of the state pretty well, and you do still have some out in the western part of the state. Not quite as common as what you see in the eastern part of the state. These are very, very common as you go east of here, but these are really important to the economy of North Carolina and our state tree. Red maple. These are starting to turn pretty. I was in the drive-thru at Chick-fil-A earlier today, and I saw some red maples, and I noticed that they were starting to turn red for the fall. They don't look like much during the year. They just kind of look like a basic, simple tree, but then in the fall, they start turning really pretty colors. So this is a red maple. These are very common in landscape use in North Carolina. Or in general. But these red maples, they kind of have got 3 to 5 lobes. Sometimes you'll see these small lobes start to form on some of your older leaves down here. This one has 3. So they're typically going to have 3 to 5. And they are normally going to be this pretty bright red in the fall whenever they start turning colors. You do have kind of a fairly smooth bark. It's not as smooth as something like a sycamore, but it's also not as rough as something like you would see on an elm tree. The fruit on them is this thing right here. It kind of looks like a weird little insect, but these fruit are called winged samara, and the winged samara fruit. When I was a kid, I used to find these, and I would hold them up, and as I would hold them up, I'd drop them, and then I'd watch them kind of helicopter and swirl down to the ground. So that's the type of fruit that all maples have, is the winged samara. Very popular landscape tree. And typically, one other thing that I forgot to mention, a lot of times, and it's kind of hard to tell in this picture, but a lot of times the petiole of the leaf, which is the stem of the leaf, is kind of a reddish color as well. So if you're having a hard time determining if something is a red maple, if you look pretty close at that petiole, then it's going to typically have kind of a reddish color. It might not be bright red, but it's going to have a reddish color to it. So that is the red maple. Next is the river birch, and I'll go back to that for just a second, just in case you wanted to pause on that so you could copy your notes down. River birch is one of my favorites, and I really think it's one of my favorites because it has some crazy looking bark. There is actually a river birch that is in the corner of the student parking lot at Crest. And if you're in cohorts A or B, I will take you out to see the river birch whenever you're in class. But the river birch, normally these grow near water, hence the name river birch. And normally when they grow naturally near water, whether it's a stream or a river, they lean. This one that's in the picture down here is obviously in somebody's landscape because it's nicely mulched around it. So it is a straight tree, but naturally occurring river birches tend to lean toward whatever body of water they're near. So again, if they're planted near a stream or a river, naturally occurring near a stream or river, they normally will lean toward that body of water. And they have what we call doubly serrated edges on the leaves. So if you think about a serrated knife, you think about knives that have edges on them. So they have these big serrates, or these big edges like a knife would have, but then they also have tiny ones inside. Those serrated edges. Another thing is for sure that papery looking bark on a river birch. I really like the way that these look and the way that the bark looks as it peels off. It's just kind of cool looking. So really distinctive tree, and one that's easy to tell from some of the other ones in our area. The next one we're going to take a look at is the shagbark hickory. And there's a lot of different types of hickory. Just like there's a lot of different types of oaks and maples and pines and things like that, there are a lot of different types of hickories. The only one that you have on your list that you have to learn for this course is the shagbark hickory. And you can see why it's named the shagbark hickory. Yes, it is going to, like any other hickory tree, it's going to have what we call a palmately compound leaf, meaning the leaf is this whole thing, because this is where the bud would have come off of the tree. So you're looking at leaflets, but it's called palmate because if you look at it, it kind of looks like a hand, like your palm. You can kind of look and see how you look like you got different fingers that are sticking out here. So a palmately compound leaf is going to look like the shape of a palm, the palm of your hand. But the shagbark part, I think that's pretty obvious because you've got this kind of shaggy looking crazy bark on this tree. So that's your shagbark hickory, and that's going to be the easiest way to be able to identify that particular one is going to be by its bark. Southern red oak, very popular tree in North Carolina, very popular landscape tree, very popular naturally occurring tree. There are lots of these throughout the coastal plain in Piedmont. Not so much when you get into the upper mountains, but you will see these in this particular area. And for me, there's several different types of oaks that have a similar look to it. This is going to be the southern red oak is what a lot of people will consider a turkey foot oak. And so you may hear somebody saying, "Oh, that's a turkey foot oak." They're actually southern red oak, but they do very much look like the foot of a turkey. So they may not have they may not have a ton of lobes, like this one only has 3 lobes, but it may have a bunch, like this one. It's a more heavily lobed leaf. So typically anywhere between, I would say, 3 to maybe even 7 lobes on a southern red oak. The acorns, the fruit of the tree, fairly small. These are not really big acorns, and very popular among the squirrels. And then you've got the furrowed gray bark there for the southern red oak. And that's actually the only oak that you have on the list. So you kind of got lucky not having to identify different types of oaks. So I kind of have a love-hate relationship with this tree because whenever I was in high school and I did the forestry competition, this was the easiest tree for me to be able to identify. And so I always looked for this tree because I knew that I would get that one right. But it has a very obnoxious feature about it, and I'm going to go to the picture, and I'm sure you will recognize and understand that obnoxious feature. So the sweet gum just looks like any old other non-assuming tree, but it has these really distinctive star-shaped leaves. So it's really easy to be able to identify as compared to a lot of other trees. The thing that makes me not like sweet gums is these. When I was a kid, I walked around barefoot a lot. So most of the time, especially during the summer, I didn't have shoes on, and we had sweet gum trees. And so, if you happen to step on one of these with no shoes on, then you would understand why I have a love-hate relationship with the sweet gum tree. Easy to identify, but painful to step on. So, lots of sweet gum trees in the state of North Carolina. You've got that nice furrowed gray bark on those. Fairly easy tree to be able to identify. 2 more trees we're going to look at. One is the white oak. Oh, so there is another oak on the list, but this one doesn't look anything like the southern red oak because it's rounded. The southern red oak, if you go back to that turkey foot oak that we looked at in just a couple of slides ago, it had pointed lobes on it. There were kind of bristle tips on the end of the lobes, where this is going to be more of a rounded lobed leaf. The white oak is going to have very, very light gray bark, hence the name white oak. It's not completely white, but it's very, very light gray. And as compared to the acorns on a southern red oak, these are much larger, more oblong type of acorns. So little different than the southern red oak because you're looking at rounded lobes and a more oblong type of acorn, and really a lighter color gray on the bark. All right, last one. There are tons of these in Cleveland County, and right now they are starting to lose their leaves. And so that's one of the reasons why I want to go ahead and jump on forestry, because I want to be able to let you get out and see these before they do lose all of their leaves, because they're one of the first ones to shed their leaves in the fall. And that's the yellow poplar. And the yellow poplar is a very popular tree in this particular area. The leaves themselves, some people say they kind of look like a cat head. I really don't get that it looks like a cat head as much as I think it kind of looks like a tulip. And then the flowers on them themselves kind of look like little tulips. So the flowers are typically on them in the spring. I think the question that goes along with this tree says something about white flowers. I see these more as kind of a light colored greenish flower, with the orange and the yellow on the bottom, but they do have these tulip looking flowers on them. And then that very distinctive shape of leaves that you see on a yellow poplar, dark or a deeply furrowed bark with just kind of a light gray color on there. So these are very, very common in this area. And I know that this has been a quick trip down forestry lane for you guys. Hopefully, if you're in cohort A or B, you'll have an opportunity to go outside and see some of these trees, do some tree identification. And if you are a remote student, I would encourage you to get outside and look at some of these trees before they actually start to lose their leaves. You will have a forestry project due with this particular unit, and so I will say that a great place to go is down to Broad River Greenway. Some of their trees are actually labeled, so that does help with the identification process. And if you are wondering and you can't figure out what a tree is, if you'll look on another link on this particular module, it's on a separate page. I have linked a common Forest Trees of North Carolina PDF file. It's a great little field guide that has got a lot of the trees that are common to North Carolina listed in it, with some descriptions and where you can find them. So if you have any questions about tree identification, I cannot identify every tree in the world, but I have spent some time learning different forestry trees and plants throughout the course of my being an ag student and a college student and career as a teacher. So I will help you to identify anything that you need some help on, but I can't make any promises, but we'll do the best we can. So if you have any questions about any of this stuff, please make sure to reach out. And next time we'll actually look at how we can measure trees in the forest. Talk to you guys next time.